Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining us on this very sunny day. My name's Mark Littlewood. Welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm the Director General here. And although we're sometimes pigeonholed rather unfairly, the IEA seeks to work with all political parties and none in spreading free market ideas. And that's why we're holding tonight a session on the Labour Party and the economy, specifically addressing the cost of living. Some believe that living standards and the cost of living, and often those two terms are used wrongly interchangeably, is set to be a key issue at the next general election. And the IEA has done quite a considerable amount of recent work on how the government might seek to address the cost of living rather than focus continually on income transfers. In fact, earlier this year we released this monograph, Redefining the Poverty Debate, in which we suggested adopting supply-side reforms to actually lower the cost of living. If you could make housing cheaper, energy cheaper, food cheaper, then perhaps the income transfers that you'd need to help those in poverty would be less. For example, on housing, has doubled in real terms in the United Kingdom since the mid-1990s. Energy prices are shooting up. The government's own estimates are that the impact of climate change policies will add around 26% to domestic electricity prices, 10% to gas prices by the time of the next election. And even on childcare, we've suggested that restrictive regulations around childcare have done a great deal to actually make childcare, if not unaffordable, certainly more expensive than it need be. Let me tell you a bit about the rules of engagement this evening. We've got a great panel. I'm going to ask each of them to speak for about 7 minutes. The only noise I want to be able to hear in this room, apart from me speaking, our panel speaking, and then Q&A from you, will be this bell. So if you've got an iPhone, a mobile phone, or some other electronic device that makes an irritating noise, I'd be very grateful if you could switch it to silent. Each of our panellists will speak for about 7 minutes, less if they choose. After about 7 minutes, this bell will get a little bit of a ring. After about 8 minutes, it will get a loud and continual ring to really encourage you to wrap up your remarks. Then we'll have about 20 or 25 minutes for questions. Let me introduce our panel in the order in which they're going to speak. On my immediate left is John Rentoul, the chief political commentator for The Independent on Sunday. He's been there since 2004. He's previously been a journalist at The New Statesman and a political reporter for BBC's On the Record. He's a visiting fellow in contemporary history at Queen Mary University of London, and his biography of Tony Blair has passed through several editions. He has been described as having a slavish admiration for Mr. Blair.
I described myself.
You described yourself? I knew you were described as such. I didn't realise it was a self-description. He's also, of course, famous for, I suppose, is it best to describe it as an internet meme? Questions to which the answer is no. I think you're up to nearly 1,000 questions to which the answer is no, which the first one was, is this the most dangerous man in Britain? Meaning Tony Blair, which was a question to which John answered no. Having read John's piece today, covering tonight's events, I think I can say, without wishing to preempt him, that he believes that the question, are complaints about the cost of living very different to complaints about economic growth, is a question to which the answer is broadly no. Well, it's a question certainly at the IEA where we consider the answer to that question to be yes. Our next panellist, Gisela Stuart, is the Labour Member of Parliament for Birmingham, Edgbaston, and has been so since 1997. She was born and raised in what was then West Germany, and after serving an apprenticeship in bookselling, she moved to Britain, graduating from the University of London. In Labour's second term in office, she was appointed as one of the UK parliamentary representatives to the European Convention, and in this capacity she also served as one of the 13 members of the Convention's Presidium. She's also the editor of the weekly political magazine, The House magazine, and actually wrote the foreword to this monograph that I've referred you to. Copies will be on sale later at a cut-down price of just £5. We're doing what we can to lower the cost of living and reading. Our third panellist is Paul Ormerod, an economist, author and entrepreneur. He is a researcher in sort of complexity, complex systems, non-linear feedback, the boom and bust cycle of business, and economic competition. He uses a multidisciplinary approach, making use of biology, physics, maths, stats, and psychology as sources of results that can be applied to economics. Along with his many articles, Paul has written 4 books: The Death of Economics, Butterfly Economics, Why Most Things Fail, Extinction in Economics, and most recently, Positive Linking, How Networks and Incentives Can Revolutionise the World. He's also a regular contributor at the IEA, both in meetings and to our publications. And last but by no means least is Dan Hodges, Telegraph blogger and columnist. Dan describes himself as a tribal neo-Blairite. He's currently a columnist for the Daily Telegraph and has also written for The Guardian and The New Statesman. He's previously worked as a parliamentary researcher, a Labour Party official and a GMB official, and has also worked for Transport for London under Ken Livingstone as Director of Communications, and back in 2011 he worked on the No to AV campaign. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to our panel this evening. John, your 7 minutes starts now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mark, for having me. And thanks for coming. I took the unusual step before this evening of posting a blog about this debate and describing the subject of the debate as meaningless drivel. So I suppose I'd better explain what I meant by that. When I hear Ed Miliband talk about a cost of living crisis, I do think, has political discourse come as low as this? I mean, when people talk about the cost of living, what they mean, or a cost of living crisis, what they mean is that there's a bit of a recession on, which there has been since 2008, and any debate about the cost of living is a debate about how best to run the economy. So it's to dignify it with the sort of special title of an argument about the cost of living seems to me a distraction from the real questions, which are, how does Labour in particular recover credibility on managing the economy, as opposed to what it seems to me that Ed Miliband is engaged in, which is the politics of pointing at things and saying, gosh, isn't that expensive, and shouldn't it be cheaper? Such as, to take Mark's example, housing. Houses, they're very expensive. They're really quite expensive, and they ought to be a lot cheaper. And Labour has got some very interesting ideas as to how to make houses cheaper, which then it sort of trails off, you see, because you can't actually make houses cheaper unless you change the laws of supply and demand. I know Ed Miliband would like to abolish the laws of supply and demand, but until he is able to do that, the only way you make houses cheaper is build an awful lot more of them, which you can't do because there are planning laws in this country, which, as the current government has found out, are rather difficult to change because people generally don't actually want houses built in front of their nice green bits that they look at. And I sort of agree with them. Train fares, similarly, I believe there's somebody called Maria Eagle, who is the shadow transport secretary, who points at train tickets quite often and says, "Gosh, that's very expensive. That should be a lot cheaper." And she has a plan for making train fares cheaper, which I think is to identify the ones that have gone up most and say they shouldn't have gone up quite as much as that, they should have gone up a bit less. And that will obviously solve the problem. Then you've got energy, that's expensive. Bills, they're expensive and they should be a lot cheaper. And whoever was responsible for them in the last Labour government really deserves a kicking. And that was Ed Miliband, who knows perfectly well that the 6 large energy companies don't operate a cartel. They are actually intensely competitive, and margins are quite tight. I mean, petrol is the main example. I mean, if you point at a petrol pump, that's quite effective politics, because that really is very, very expensive, and everybody knows that it's mostly tax, and therefore it ought to be a lot cheaper. And you make it a lot cheaper by taxing it less, and then you have to find the money from somewhere else, but you're not actually going to say where that comes from. But it's true that fuel duty is very, very unpopular. So the Labour Party ought to concentrate on cutting fuel duty and getting the money from somewhere else, which Ed Balls has just discovered today is taking winter fuel allowance away from people. That should bring the price of petrol down by about, what, 0.1 pence per litre or something like that, I should think. But TNS BMRB, I will bore you with some figures, did ask people which are the most unpopular taxes, which taxes you resent paying most. 51% of people said fuel duty, 34% said council tax, 31% said VAT, inheritance tax was 26%, which is why George Osborne wanted to cut that when he was in opposition, and income tax and national insurance 20%. So obviously what you should do is cut fuel duty and put up income tax. Problem solved.
Right, thank you very much for your thoughts. Gisela.
Well, I have to change my introduction because I was about to I now realise that John's the most perfect analytical pessimist who will tell you why nothing worked in more elegant ways than anybody else. And I expect Dan will tell you what Labour should do if only he was prepared to stay in opposition for the rest of the century. And then Paul will tell us why whatever we do, it's going to fail anyway. So I thought of just sort of tease this out into two things, which is, first of all, what should Labour do about anything? Unless actually Labour does it because he wants to form the next government, it's actually of no interest to anybody what Labour thinks, if it's a plan to remain in opposition. And I also haven't quite realised there's going to be this kind of total loving of the Blairites. Because I used to tease Tony and say, I was a Blairite before you knew what a Blairite was. And with that I meant that I came from a continental social democratic tradition, which is very much where it took. And I've got on my pin board one of those. I don't know many of you remember one of those? The pledge cards. And other than Tony looking so much younger, like all of us did when I was a Blair babe and he was the first elected the Prime Minister. But the key thing, if you look back on this, the pledges which led to a massive Labour landslide in 1997 were, with hindsight, extraordinarily modest. You know, we're going to reduce class sizes to below 30. We're going to reduce the NHS waiting list by 100,000. You know, this is how ambitious it was. So in terms of the question of what Labour should do in cost of living, it's not so much that you need the kind of complicated 1983 Labour manifesto. You actually need very simple messages which allow people to have a sense of where Labour is going, but also determine their own behaviour. And I didn't think I would quite so fundamentally agree with John, that I do think this is a meaningful debate. And the reason why I think it's a meaningful debate is when you look at the consequences of the 1997 welfare to work programme that Labour brought in, which in a sense, the Tories, whilst they don't realise it, they're still continuing, which means you want a system where being in work is always going to be better off than being out of work, for which you needed your minimum wage and all the benefits on there. You get to the point when housing, food and energy disproportionately rise, and you know, wherever you look in the latest ASTA survey, because part of the fallout of 2008 was that wages haven't increased as much as they have in previous years. However, the basic cost of living elements of your daily expenditure have rocketed. How do you deal with that? And one of the key things of the IEA pamphlet were two things which I think Labour should remember, and that John is absolutely right: supply and demand. It is no good dealing with a housing crisis the way George Osborne does, by saying, tell you what, love, the government's going to give you some extra money so you can borrow more and guarantee part of your mortgage. Well, if you don't increase the stock of housing, what do you think is going to happen? Prices are just going to go up. And what's more, it's going to be the government who's going to partially underwrite part of the mortgage boom. And I thought that's where the American housing boom came in. So it is absolutely right that if we say the lowest group of income is disproportionately affected by some of the costs of food, energy and housing, that if you want to deal with that, is rather than saying we are going to increase the benefits, you actually reduce the prices of them. And one of my kind of maverick ideas, and because there are economists not just here, but that's what the IEA is for, you can think about it. I went back to one of the great Birmingham radicals, a guy called Joe Chamberlain. And when he took over Birmingham in late 19th century, he ran it like a business, and he municipalised water and gas. And he did two things which said water should never make a profit because it was a public health good, and any money would go back into providing the infrastructure, whereas gas, when it made profit, actually should be going back into reducing the rates. So I do think there's a case for looking at some of the ownership structures of our utilities when they're not run for the benefit of its shareholders. Because again, I don't agree with you that you're right, the utilities at the moment are fiercely competing with each other, but never in the interest of the user. They're competing with each other in terms of the interest of the shareholder. And what you never see is that when the prices go down, that the cost of the consumer goes down. So, yes, reduce the prices, but the second thing, which was what I think the big lesson for the Labour Party, is don't be driven by electoral positioning. It is the worst thing if you're in your first term in opposition and you for the first time ever you've got the luxury when you know when your next election is, which is in 2015. Don't go down gimmicky routes 2 years away from a general election in an economic climate which is more unpredictable than I've ever been. In my memory, it has ever been. So don't go for that. The second thing is be absolutely clear in some very simple messages which affect people's behaviour. Because this is the whole thing. If you as a government wish to influence people's behaviour, they actually have to know what the rules are. And the third thing, and this should be music to the ears of the IEA, don't ever fall for this silly idea that it is governments which produce prosperity. Governments can provide the right framework for prosperity, but they themselves don't do it. And that takes me back to my roots. I was born in what was then West Germany. And I always say we have to rediscover the big lesson which made Germany so prosperous. And that was Ludwig Erhard, its first economic minister. And its big lesson was that markets in themselves are social. It is the markets which challenge monopolies. It is the markets which allow outsiders in. And if government thinks that just by increasing regulations and increasing controlling the markets, they can actually create that prosperity, they're deeply, deeply misguided. Well, what government should do is be clear in the framework within markets operating, and it is then that competition within that framework which will produce that prosperity. So, cost of living is a problem because it disproportionately affects the poor. You solve it by actually increasing the supply, and the third thing is accept the social element of markets rather in a futile attempt to try and control them. And then, actually, I think we might have a Labour government in 2015.
Thank you, Paul.
Well, thanks very much. Gisela mentioned Joseph Chamberlain, but I've been doing a bit of history. I've been rereading Michael Foot's 2-volume biography of an Iron Bevan. Well, it's not so much a biography, it's a sort of fairy story about this living saint who goes out and slays various dragons. So there's a marvellous footnote about the meeting, a 1950 meeting of a major London trade union branch, when they're discussing the crucial question of their gala dinner. And they're saying, well, it was resolved not to have a political speaker, but an entertainer. And it was agreed to have a conjurer. Mr. Harold Wilson was proposed, which will mean something to some of the audience, but not to everybody. But I'm just rereading this made me just reflect about what's happened to social democratic parties in these intervening years over the post-war period, not just in Britain but across the Western world. And although names remain the same, the parties have been fundamentally transformed. And what we've seen, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years, has been the complete capture of these parties by the public sector middle class. And the parties are actually fronts for this interest group who spend a lot of effort trying to preserve their monopoly position and secure rent from the rest of the population for their activities. Now there's a measure of this when we look at it, and we should look at what happens to public spending under Attlee in the late 1940s as a share of national output. What was it indeed under Harold Wilson when he formed his first government from 1964 to 1970, and what has it been under David Cameron? Now this is the only bit of economics I'm going to talk about. The figure that's normally quoted, and it's got real traction, it's an important figure, is when we include the costs of benefits. When we include benefits, so what's the proportion of state spending in GDP, and that rose enormously under Gordon Brown. It's now bigger than it was in than it is in Germany for the first time for many, many years. It's about 47%. So that's a share of total spending in national output. Now that's important because people have to pay taxes to finance it. But a big chunk of that is what we call transfers. It's the benefits. It's pensions, it's unemployment benefits, a whole series of benefits. There's a second figure within that is a separate figure which actually essentially measures the wages and salaries of people who work in the public sector as a percentage of total national output. So that's the figure I'm going to talk about today. Under Clem Attlee, which was the most socialist government in British history, we just essentially had central planning in the Second World War, rationing was still in place, it averaged 17.4% of the economy went to wages and salaries of people employed in the public sector. Flash forward to Harold Wilson in 1964-70, it averaged 18%. Now, under this cruel government we've currently got in power, it's averaged 22.4%. Now, these percentages may seem small, they're only sort of a few percentage points here and there, but let's actually translate this into real cash. So under Attlee, under the socialist government of Attlee, 17.4%, under David Cameron, 22.4%, and 5 percentage points of GDP is £75 billion. So I think Labour should have the slogan of let's go back to Clem Attlee and have some socialism and get our state spending to the levels that it was then. And then, of course, if we do that, there's a huge amount of money available to be saved. I agree very much. It should go on cutting fuel tax and cutting VAT. And that would do an immense amount, especially for the poorer parts of the population. And we should go through, Labour should go through root and branch, point by point, aspects of public expenditure and ask a fundamental question. Whose interest does this piece of expenditure serve? Does it serve the interests of the producers, essentially the professional middle class, or does it serve the benefit of the consumer? And if it's the former, get rid of it. Let's go back to Clem Attlee. Let's have a public sector that actually produces things for the consumer rather than the rent seekers in the public sector who capture it for their own sectional interests. And I think this will make a tremendous difference. And it could be dressed up, we could go back, we could talk about Nair and Bevan, socialism, the language of priorities. I mean, she might have a difficult time selling this within the PLP, but you can get the rhetoric. Well, this is a serious proposition. It's been this creep up and creep up and creep up, which has extracted taxation from the rest of the population, which means many people are struggling. So let's go back to Attlee, reduce public spending, and use it on cutting VAT and cutting fuel duty. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was delighted to be invited this evening. I was also a little bit nervous because obviously the IAA has a reputation for being a forum for formulating very sort of serious and deep and meaningful policy. And I always find serious, deep, meaningful policy to be the mortal enemy of good political journalism. So I was a little bit sort of caught for how I was going to pitch things this evening. And what I thought I'd do, I thought I'd fall back on actually an article that I'd been thinking about but hadn't yet come around to drafting, which was to think about what do organisations like the IA try to do, and they try to come up with policies, and then they hope to persuade our politicians to implement them. But obviously before they do so, the politicians are obviously very much influenced by the nature of the existing political debate and political discourse. And I was quite interested to step back and just look in relation to the various issues that we're talking about this evening. I'm conscious it's quite a wide brief we're trying to deal with, but just look at where sort of the nature of that debate currently sits. And it occurred to me thinking about this in all seriousness that I think in about 20 to 30 years' time, when we could look back at the nature of the political debate we had around these issues, we will look back at it in the same way that we currently look back at the way people used to debate ducking witches. And to give you an example of this, I don't know if any of you saw the debate that took the select committee session that took place. I think it was last week, when Margaret Hodge was I think interrogating would be a generous way of putting it. One of the senior executives from Google, and Google are obviously one of, was it Google, was it Yahoo? Was it Google or was it Yahoo? One of them anyway. I think it was Google. Let's say for sake of argument, it was Google. And basically Google are one of the great international success stories, and they employ hundreds of thousands of people and have just set up a new office here in London, and are basically, I think, what most people would regard generally as a positive example of good business practice in relative terms. But obviously she came on to the issue of taxation, and she sat there in the select committee in what is one of the leading sort of inquisitorial forums, if not the inquisitorial forums that we have in this country. And she sat there and she looked across the table at this man, and she looked him straight in the eye and she said, in all seriousness, I think you do evil. I think you do evil. Now, this, as I say, was Google. This is not a company that I think, that I to my knowledge, sort of makes things like napalm, or has ever run a tanker aground anywhere and polluted an environmental haven. It certainly doesn't sort of employ people in the conditions we saw in that terrible factory collapse the other day. And yet, she says to him, "You do evil," and that then frames the debate. And we sit there and it gets recorded, and we say to ourselves, well, maybe she went a bit over the top, but she's got a point. And other people say, well, yeah, she's got a point there. Instead of saying what we should say, is this woman gone absolutely staring mad? What is going on? Where is this debate going? Now, let me give you another example, and for the sake of political balance, I'll shift to the other side of the political fence. Obviously, we have the election. Coalition comes in, and basically then starts to put forward what I would describe as a sort of almost a wartime narrative. It's Churchillian. It's we're facing a great crisis, and we have to govern together, and we have to evoke that blitz spirit, and we're all in this together, and we've got to tighten our belts, and the key thing is we're all going to be asked to, and we're all going to have to make great personal sacrifices. And by and large, we sort of wave our, keep calm, and carry on sort of tea towels and buy into that narrative. And then the Prime Minister, who, by the way, I think is broadly doing a good job, then stands up and says, "Oh yeah, by the way, just one other thing. When we're all tightening that belt and making all these sacrifices, just to let you know, top 1%, we're going to be cutting their tax. We're going to be cutting their tax." And again, you sit there and you think, well, is that really the way we should be framing the debate about taxation? Let's look at another issue. Let's look at how we're framing the debate, or how our politicians are framing the debate on regulation, the regulatory regime, as obviously colleagues have already touched on. A couple of years ago, Ed Miliband, who obviously is I'm a great fan and admirer of Ed Miliband, gave a speech at Labour Party conference in which he defined business quite neatly into producers and predators. And Some people thought that was a good speech, that was an innovative speech, not me, I would hasten to add, but some people did. And, you know, since then Edmund Miliband's fortunes have ebbed and flowed, and as they have done, the sort of the wisdom and currency of that speech have ebbed and flowed with it. But basically we've been sitting there, and I've been sitting there, and others have been sitting there, we're just waiting for him to expand and build on this grand theme. And fair play to him a couple of weeks ago, again, was it last week, week before he did it, again he turned up, and again I think it was at Google, and he started to map out and flesh out what he actually meant by this. And he identified that in terms of a producer, what he had in mind and the example of a good producer and what basically Labour's sort of economic regulatory strategy is going to be based on is Willy Wonka, a fictitious chocolate manufacturer. And then, in fairness, he then went on, and then he came to the other side of the fence, and he said that his example of a predatory business or a predatory business practitioner was with Mr. Burns from The Simpsons, who, as you obviously are aware, is a cartoon character. If I had written that Ed Miliband would flesh out his policy in that way by using cartoon characters and fictitious chocolate manufacturers, I would have been condemned for just making it up. But that is the nature of where the debate has come. This is a man who in 2 years' time will change the country, and his inspiration is Willy Wonka. And I think when we get to that point in the public debate, I think we should all need to ask serious questions. Again, in the interest of political balance, though, let me just flip to another side, which is another interesting story. Again, in terms of the way the regulatory debate has been framed, and it was this fantastic story that I can't remember whether I heard it or read it, which was when Hank Paulson, the former American Treasury Secretary, went. I think it was the last big sort of swanky dinner that the sort of the U.S. banking industry, I think the international banking industry, held in New York just before the great banking collapse. And he was sitting at dinner, and he had one of the, I think either side, these two sort of bankers next to him on one side, and one of the bankers leant over, and he just said to him, he said, "Well, Hank," he said, "you've got to stop us." And he looked at him and he said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "You have to stop us. We just can't go on this. We are on this ridiculous cycle now where we are taking more risk, and I am taking more risk, and I'm generating more profit, and therefore my board and my shareholders expect me to take more risk and take more profit, and my competitors are taking even greater risk, and and you have got to. I've got to stop myself, obviously. You've got to get us off this sort of thing." And Paulson said, "Well, what can I do? We can't do it." And we all know the consequences of that. That was the nature of the debate as it was framed on the other side of the fence, and we all stand up today and we say it was Gordon Brown's fault, and he blew it. But David Cameron, George Osborne, they weren't telling Gordon Brown urging more regulation. They were urging less regulation. And again, when the nature of the debate gets to the point where even the people who are being regulated are saying, please God, regulate us more, again, I think that's something that we need to think about. And so, what I would say as we move forward, I think it is beholden on all of us, those of us who have a public forum, those who engage with organisations, beholden on all of us as we move forward, to at least, whatever solutions we come up with, at least try and get the debate into a sensible or even rational place, so that Willy Wonka keeps, his place, Mr. Burns keeps his place, and we can start to develop public policy on a slightly more rational and balanced framework. Thank you.